So we learned the main parts of the brain. Now let's start learning some of the structures located within these main parts of the brain. So I know this looks really complicated. Don't freak out on me. Okay, it's going to be all right. This is the cortices of the brain colored so that we can distinguish them. And as you can imagine, it's kind of hard to distinguish them because some of them break, at a sulcus, and some of them kind of don't. So I am going to expect you to know only a few of these. Okay, so let's break it down and get to know each of them individually. So the frontal lobe is, the one on the front. It contains two main parts: the primary motor cortex, which controls your voluntary motor control and coordinates with the primary motor association area, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the most anterior part of the frontal lobe. And that's where your personality sits. That controls your concentration, verbal communication, but also decision-making, planning, and personality. So all of that is in your frontal lobe. That is also the last area of the brain to develop. So one of the reasons that teenagers tend to be fairly impulsive is that their frontal lobes aren't done developing. It doesn't finish until you're in your early 20s. So looking at the brain here, this is the prefrontal area, which is your personality. But let's start back here. We're going to start with the primary motor cortex here, which covers the precentral gyrus. So if I ask you what the bulge is called, you would say it's the precentral gyrus. If I asked you what cortex is located there, you would say the primary motor cortex. Okay, so make sure you read the question so you can answer it correctly. So the primary motor cortex, remember, motor means movement. This is the area that controls the movement of your body. It's also called the somatic motor area or somatic motor cortex. And this is going to control all of your voluntary muscle movement, all of the muscles that move your skeleton. The neurons here do cross to the opposite side, either within the brainstem or somewhere in the spinal cord, so that the right motor cortex controls the left side of your body. The information from here is processed in the area in front of it called the association area. It's either called the premotor cortex or the somatic motor association area. That's the more common term. So if you think about the areas of the motor cortex are specific to a specific part of the body. So they send out an order to move the index finger, move the second finger, move the third finger. The association area is going to coordinate those movements together and with other muscles to make sure that they all work together to make the motion that we're doing. So all skilled motor activities are controlled through there. Now I do want to talk about one little spot called the frontal eye field, which, depending on which diagram you look at, is either in the motor cortex or in front of the motor cortex. The frontal eye field, and no, I'm not going to ask you where it is, except that it's in the frontal lobe. That's all you need to know. This is a really specific thing that controls horizontal eye movements, such as when you read or when you're watching someone or something moving across your field of vision from left to right. And what it does is it smooths out the eye movements when you're following something. It's very easy for your eye to smoothly follow that thing across your field of vision. If you don't have anything to follow, if you're just trying to move your eyes across your field of vision without something to follow, your eyes jump from one thing to the next. So our eyes and our brain are really good at picking out patterns. And so when your eye is moving, for example, looking across a horizon, we're looking for something to focus on. So the frontal eye field is in charge of that, and it also coordinates the binocular vision. So the frontal eye fields of the two hemispheres coordinate the movement of the two eyes so that they are looking at the same thing. Now, The frontal lobotomy. I'm just really quickly. The frontal lobotomy was developed by this neurologist Igaz Moniz, who was Portuguese. This was back long before there were any treatments for mental illnesses. And Moniz was dealing with people who were, for lack of a better term, out of control. And he said, you know what? Since the front of the brain controls decision making and impulse control, if I destroyed that part of the brain, or at least blocked connections, broke connections in that part of the brain, could I restore impulse control? Now, that's a wackadoodle line of thinking, but he said, hey, I'm going to try this. So he took a needle probe, really a sharp, thick needle, stuck it up through the bone in the eye socket, which is very, very thin bone, up into the frontal lobe, and wiggled it around to destroy the connections between the parts of this frontal lobe, and then found that the patients that he had used this on were actually calmed down by it. Why? We don't really know. He did receive the Nobel Prize for it, a Nobel Prize that has not been taken away. Even though it doesn't work, it was kind of a bizarre thing that this treatment worked on the patients he was working with. And then a lot of people decided that if there was this treatment that could be used on some annoying patients, then maybe it could be used on all of them. And so it became really overused as a way to really make annoying people less annoying and more controllable. And then it turned out there were a lot of side effects of getting a needle stuck up into your frontal lobe. And so finally, after being overused for a couple of decades, people stopped using it. It is now almost never done, and it's done in a much more targeted way when it is used. Anyway, so that's what a frontal lobotomy is. So that's the frontal lobe and the areas of the frontal lobe. I'm going to pause there, and then I'll start again to do the next section, which will go through the other lobes.